behind the neighbor's door. It was December, and the neighborhood had started decorating for the holidays. I knew all my neighbors, and they were all very friendly. The neighbors lit up the streets with their festive displays. Paul, our neighbor to the right, was no different. He had put up his lights early, which I found unusual for a single man in his 40s. He seemed kind enough, though a bit lonely. I didn't see him often. He came and went for work, but I always greeted him when we crossed paths. Recently, though, I hadn't seen him at all. His car hadn't moved from the driveway in days. One night, I noticed Paul's house across the street. His Christmas lights were flickering wildly, not the usual twinkling effect. It was erratic, more like a wiring glitch. The flickering lights gave the house an unsettling feeling. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just some electrical issue, nothing to worry about. The next morning, I went to work. Paul's car was still in the driveway, and once again, all his curtains were tightly shut. That evening, I went outside and saw everything was exactly the same as the night before. I decided to be kind and let him know, as well as check if he was okay since I hadn't seen him. I walked over, hesitating for a moment before knocking on the door. There was no answer, so I rang the bell. Again, nothing. After the third ring, Paul finally opened the door. Paul greeted me with a forced smile. I told him about his flickering Christmas lights and how I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I asked if he was okay, since I hadn't seen him in a while. He said he just wasn't feeling well. From the way he spoke, I felt his demeanor was awkward and cold. I noticed when he raised his hand, there were black smudges or soot on it. I glanced down briefly, and he immediately pulled his hand back behind him. Then I heard something from inside the house. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it sounded like a child's voice. Paul didn't have any kids. I was about to ask if he heard it too, but I decided against it. It sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Paul, but he didn't seem to notice. The sound seemed to come from deep within his house, distant and muffled. His expression didn't change, but there was a coldness in his eyes. I was about to leave, but something inside me, an indescribable feeling, held me back. Then I decided to go back. He was about to close the door when he seemed surprised to see me return. I awkwardly made an excuse, asking if I could borrow some tools to fix a pipe. He politely and courteously invited me into the house. While Paul was rummaging through things in the living room, I asked if I could use the bathroom. On the way, I noticed something strange, a bookshelf in an almost empty room. It was placed in an oddly conspicuous spot and had a few stacks of cardboard boxes. As I got closer, I noticed dark stains on the walls and smudges on the bookshelf. They looked strange. Drawn by the oddity, I tried to take a closer look.
Is it making a knocking sound?
I thought I heard something and slowly moved closer to investigate. It sounded almost like something or someone was moving behind the bookshelf. Just as I reached out to touch it, Paul suddenly appeared in the doorway, asking, "What are you doing?" I quickly lied, saying I was just admiring some of the books. Glancing at the bookshelf, I smiled and asked,
Do you enjoy detective and mystery stories too? Let's talk about them.
But he gave a forced smile and nodded.
Sure. Now can you leave?
Seeing this, I decided to leave. After leaving, my mind was filled with questions. Why was Paul acting so strange? Why did that room feel so unsettling? It left me with a genuinely weird and uneasy feeling. I decided I would keep a closer eye on him for my own safety. A few days later, I kept observing and devised a plan. I stood in front of Paul's house with some pastries in hand, ready to knock and invite him to a Christmas gathering. As usual, Paul politely declined the invitation, but mentioned he might stop by later. A few minutes later, I saw Paul leave his house, get into his car, and drive off to somewhere suspicious. Seizing the opportunity, I cautiously made my way to the back of his house. He might return quickly since the back door wasn't locked. I hesitated for a moment, considering leaving, unsure if this was the right thing to do. But then my eyes caught something that made me realize I couldn't hesitate any longer. I saw it, the trash can outside Paul's house. Items that didn't belong, rags stained with dark streaks and dried specks that looked like blood, and even children's clothing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The door creaked open, and I slipped inside. The house was silent, eerily still. I cautiously moved toward the bookshelf I had seen and suspected earlier. As I approached the shelf, I fumbled around and noticed a book sticking out oddly. I grabbed it and pulled it out. As I pulled it, the bookshelf suddenly shifted, revealing a dark space that looked like a hidden room. I stepped inside and was utterly horrified. The room was a chaotic mess, boxes, shattered items, and strange objects scattered everywhere. In the far corner, something moved in the shadows. I took another step forward, feeling the weight of the air pressing down on me. Then, there he was, a little boy, trembling and trapped in the basement, his wide eyes filled with fear. My first instinct was to help the boy. I barely managed to remove the gag from his mouth when footsteps echoed through the house. Paul was back. My worst fear had come true. I quickly crouched down and whispered urgently to the boy, telling him to stay quiet as I guided him to hide. I hurriedly ran to find a different hiding spot, but Paul already suspected someone was in the house and began searching. He discovered me when I carelessly let part of my shirt show. He stomped on my shirt and said,
You shouldn't have come here.
Before I could react, Paul grabbed a nearby baseball bat and began swinging it forcefully at me. I barely dodged the first blow. Objects shattered around me. I rushed toward the kitchen, hoping to distract him and keep him away from the boy. My hand grabbed a pepper shaker, and I threw it into Paul's face to obscure his vision. But it didn't faze him at all. Taking advantage of his momentary blindness, I grabbed a frying pan and struck him on the head, forcing him to stagger back. The blows he landed on me left painful bruises, and his strength was greater than I had anticipated. I kept running to distract him, but I realized too late that he had gone down to the basement to find the boy. I called the police and ran down, throwing objects to distract him. I shouted at him to surrender, warning him that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Paul pretended to surrender or negotiate, but he immediately launched a surprise attack when I let my guard down. Once again, I found myself at a disadvantage. He grabbed my neck and began choking me as I desperately reached for a glass bottle nearby, but I couldn't grasp it. I was nearly losing consciousness from the strangulation when, unexpectedly, the boy screamed, distracting Paul and giving me an opening. I seized the moment, grabbed the bottle, and struck him on the head. With a painful groan, Paul staggered back and finally released his grip on my neck. I quickly got up, pulled the boy up the basement stairs, and locked every door behind me. The police arrived within minutes, surrounding Paul's house. Paul was arrested, but what they uncovered left me horrified. The boy had been abducted from a completely different town and had been held in the basement for over 4 days. As for the flickering Christmas lights, the boy was a genius who had somehow figured out how to manipulate them from the basement as a cry for help to attract someone's attention outside. The nightmare was finally over. I was relieved that the boy was reunited with his family. I hoped he would go on to live a normal life and overcome this ordeal. The Hitchhiker's Trap. This happened in the winter of 1993, when Keely was 20 years old. It was 1:30 May. When Keely finished her shift at the factory, and stopped at a gas station to fill up her smoking car. The gas station was nearly empty, except for a few cars parked in the distance. While Keely was pumping gas, a woman began approaching. She appeared to be around Keely's age, approaching with a frightened, distressed, and anxious look. The woman spoke hurriedly, out of breath. She said she had argued with her boyfriend and needed to use a payphone to call a friend for a ride. Keely listened, but her unease grew as the woman explained that she had been harassed and feared the men in a light green car parked next to the gas station's dumpster. Initially hesitant, Keely noted that the woman was dressed neatly and wasn't drunk or anything similar. She just seemed genuinely anxious and scared. So, after finishing her refueling, Keely told her to get in the car. As they drove down a dark, quiet street, Keely asked where the woman lived. The woman kept glancing into the rearview mirror, fidgeting in her seat. She didn't answer Keely's question, just mumbled something incomprehensible. Then she asked Keely to take her to a house not far away on the edge of town. When they arrived, it looked unusual, almost abandoned. Keely asked skeptically, "You live here?" She simply told Keely the house was under renovation and asked her to wait outside for a moment. Keely reluctantly got out of the car and leaned on the hood. She called back, asking Keely to help her. Still trying to make sense of everything, Keely reluctantly agreed and approached the porch. However, as Keely neared the house, a sense of hesitation crept over her. Something about this house, and the woman felt off. Just as she reached out to touch the doorknob, a loud bang erupted behind her. Time seemed to freeze, and she felt a sharp pain at the back of her head. Everything spun as the pain surged, and the next thing she knew, she was collapsing onto the ground in front of the porch. Keely's vision blurred, but she could still see the woman standing over her with a smug smile. "Thanks for the help," she said, as darkness consumed Keely, punctuated by her chilling laughter. When Keely woke up, her wrists and ankles were tightly bound with rope. Her head throbbed with pain as she lay on the floor of a dark, filthy room reeking of mildew. Keely didn't dare move, but observed what was happening. The woman sat on a chair not far away, holding up her phone on a video call. "You should mind your own business," she said, not even glancing at Keely. Keely regained her vision and focused on the phone screen. It was a man standing next to a car, the same one she had seen at the gas station. He said he'd pick her up soon to catch more victims. She realized everything from the start had been a trap. Keely struggled against her restraints, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast. Despite the pain, Keely, being the only woman at the plastic factory, had learned to handle such situations. She relied on her experience to quietly inspect and work on her restraints. Finally, the rope loosened slightly, but the woman began approaching Keely, so she decided to stay still, pretending nothing was amiss. When the woman seemed to sense something, she moved closer to Keely. The moment arrived, Keely sprang up, elbowing her in the face. She turned and kicked the woman hard with her bound feet, causing her to stumble painfully to the ground. That gave Keely the chance to free her legs and run outside. Keely dashed outside and got into her car. As she frantically started the engine, the woman suddenly appeared with a menacing smile. Somehow, she had gotten into Keely's car. "Mind giving me a ride?" Just as the car started, the woman, not wearing her seatbelt, was thrown forward as Keely hit the accelerator. Keely pushed the woman out of the car and drove off, calling the police to have them arrested. When Keely finally got home, she told her sister about the harrowing encounter. While relieved that Keely was safe, her sister scolded her for not going to the police immediately. After a few days of investigation, the police arrested the two criminals. Keely couldn't believe what had happened, but at least she had survived. And she learned a terrifying lesson about the hidden dangers in seemingly harmless situations. The mysterious house in the deep forest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace. Nick sat in the chair, lost in thought. He remembered what he had gone through and seemed unable to escape that feeling. In the late 80s, Nick and his friend Ken, both experienced hikers, decided to take a different route from their usual long-distance trails. They passed through the woods behind the farm, intrigued by a nearby ranch that raised exotic animals like cassowaries, strange and out of place in the countryside. They ventured deeper into the forest, the trees becoming denser as they moved further from familiar grounds. The air was filled with a damp smell as they pushed through thick underbrush, their excitement gradually building. As they continued walking, they strayed off the path and came upon an old, dilapidated house neither of them had seen before. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Just looking at the house gave Nick an ominous feeling, but they couldn't resist their purpose, to explore, so they naturally decided to go inside and check it out. Inside, the house had a very classic style, probably built in the late 40s or early 50s. But Ken saw and witnessed something even more terrifying. There were writings and symbols in strange, Latin-like languages about a worship ritual believed to be satanic or pagan. Some of the images depicted how to sacrifice human souls to an entity believed to be demonic, leaving them in disbelief. Ken exclaimed, as it was the first time he'd seen anything like it. To this day, and even at that moment, Nick still insists that some of the symbols painted on the walls were not merely red paint. The kitchen was cramped, and there was a narrow staircase leading upstairs. It was so tight that their shoulders would brush against the walls as they ascended. As they climbed the stairs, Nick felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He glanced back, but saw only Ken behind him. Ken stopped midway, frozen in place, insisting that he had seen a shadow dart across the stairs above. Nick forced a smile to reassure him, even though he too felt something was off. Their fear seemed to be increasingly palpable. The upstairs was pitch dark, with a room at the end of a narrow hallway. Leading to it were strange, dried red streaks that looked like blood seeping into the floor. As soon as they entered the room, they were confronted with many similar strange symbols. What caught their attention was the sight of chains with handcuffs hanging from the walls, as if someone had tried to lock something or someone in this very room. Then, the faint sound of chains clinking filled the room. The chains hanging on the walls began to sway, as if moved by an unseen force, despite the windows being tightly shut and no breeze present. Suddenly, they heard a noise, footsteps approaching from behind, resembling the sound of heels tapping on wood, quickly ascending the stairs behind them. Terrified, they ran down the stairs, but found no one there. The house fell silent once again, except for their labored breathing. There were no new footprints, only the ones they had left when they entered. Too frightened to stay, they decided to leave the house. But no matter which direction they took or how they used the compass, they tried it more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction. Yet, they always ended up standing in front of the house's main door. They tried again and again, walking in every conceivable direction, but the result was always the same. Caught in a disorienting and seemingly hopeless loop, they became utterly exhausted and terrified. Standing before the house one final time, they were met with something far worse. At that moment, Ken nearly fainted before looking up and pointing to the front-facing window on the second floor of the house. Nick and Ken crouched, frozen in fear. There it was, a figure. Yes, they both saw it. A tall, shadowy woman stood at the window, staring at them. Though they couldn't discern her facial features, her large, dark eyes were unmistakable. Then, she vanished instantly. Overcome with terror, they ran as fast as they could through the forest, eventually stopping at the edge of a federal road about 3 miles from the house. To this day, they still don't know how they managed to find their way back. It felt like a miracle. 5 years later, Nick and Kin decided to return to the house. But this time, when they arrived, the house had completely collapsed, leaving only rubble and debris. Nick later stumbled upon an online article about the house. Don was a man with unusual behavior. He had locked his mother in the attic and abused her for years, then used the house for his own sinister purposes. The weight of the truth slowly sank into Nick as he learned about the story and the dark history behind it. Now looking back, Nick realized that some things are better left buried, and some houses should never be revisited. The kidnapper's scary plan. Lily was on her way home from her best friend Emma's house. Emma's house was on a hill, and despite Emma urging Lily to stay over, she decided to head home. It was only 7:30 p.m., and she decided to take the bus. At the nearby bus stop, she arrived and saw a man already sitting there. He looked a bit strange, appearing to be homeless. The man's unsettling presence made Lily uncomfortable. She decided to keep her distance and stood there with a serious expression. Emma called her to ask if she had boarded the bus yet. Lily talked to her for a while, trying to ease the discomfort caused by the man's presence. Despite trying to ignore him, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. Every 5 to 10 seconds, he would take out his phone and appear busy texting. After ending the call, Lily glanced at her phone. It was 7:45 p.m., and her battery was down to 10%. She sighed, annoyed that she hadn't charged it earlier. She stared at the long, empty highway, but there was no sign of the bus. She felt uneasy being alone with the strange man. Then the man stood up from his seat and started walking toward Lily. She looked away, trying to focus on her phone screen as he approached her.
Hey, got a lighter?
Without looking up, Lily curtly replied.
I don't smoke.
She could hear him moving behind her, but didn't dare to turn around. A moment later, she turned around, and he was standing right in front of her. His eyes stared at her vacantly, and his smile was eerie, grotesque.
Are you sure? All girls pretend they don't like attention, but they all love it.
Leave me alone.
She yelled loudly, threatening that if he didn't back off, she would scream and call the police, warning him that her friend's house was nearby and her friend's dad owned a gun. His smile vanished, and she thought she was safe. Then headlights appeared as a car pulled up, driven by an older woman who offered Lily a ride. Surprised but not hesitating, Lily seized the chance to escape the unsettling situation. She quickly got into the car without a second thought, leaving the man behind. As the car drove away, Lily saw the man smiling in the rearview mirror, and his expression sent chills down her spine. They drove off, and the woman smiled as Lily thanked her. But her friendly demeanor seemed odd when she turned to Lily and said,
Women need to be careful these days. You never know when you'll walk into a trap.
The woman drove slowly along the dark highway. After a while, they stopped at a deserted gas station parking lot. Lily watched the woman step out and shut the car door behind her. Lily wanted to call her parents to let them know, but she remembered her phone was dead. Just then, a ringtone sounded, and her eyes fell on a phone lying casually on the dashboard. She thought the woman must have forgotten it. She cautiously reached out to grab it. The phone unlocked without needing a password. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over her. The phone's wallpaper flashed on the screen, showing a picture of the woman standing next to a man. He was the same man Lily had seen at the bus stop. Somehow, they were connected. Panicked, she quickly grabbed the phone and slipped out of the car, but not fast enough. The woman returned, her kind expression gone, blocking the door.
Where do you think you're going, girl?
Lily stumbled, slipping through the driver's side door to get out. As she escaped, the woman circled around the back of the car, brandishing a knife to block her path. The woman lunged at her, and instinctively, Lily raised her arm to shield herself, causing the blade to slice painfully across her skin. Lily turned to run, but the woman grabbed her hair and yanked her back. Lily screamed, twisting and clawing at her hand. Blood dripped down her arm, her strength fading from the injury. But then, a surge of survival instinct kicked in. Lily stomped and kicked at the woman's shin, making her stumble and giving Lily a brief chance to escape. As Lily sprinted toward the road, headlights appeared in the distance. It was a truck. Desperate, she waved frantically, hoping they would stop. The truck slowed down as they saw her. The woman stood just behind her and yelled,
She's stealing from me. Stop her.
A man stepped out. Lily could only cry out.
She's lying. She tried to kidnap me.
He hesitated, but the sight of Lily's bleeding arm seemed to convince him. She quickly got into his truck, and they headed to the police station. Luckily, she had evidence, her phone. It was a treasure trove of proof. They were kidnappers preying on women and children. They had a twisted scheme. The man would harass women, and the woman would pretend to be a savior. Once inside the car, the victim had no escape. Luckily, Lily avoided becoming their next victim. Months later, she still thought about that night. Since then, Lily had bought a car and vowed never to take public transportation alone at night again. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, they sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, no one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face, but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it. But she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there. Watching her from behind the glass, she shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings before leaving this strange place forever. Message on the mirror. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. The Bloody Delivery. A quiet, secluded suburban neighborhood with winding streets and houses far apart. My name is Nick, and I'm just a pizza delivery guy trying to make a living. Tonight is cold and rainy, the kind of night where windshield wipers have to work overtime. I've been driving these streets for months now, delivering pizzas to people who barely acknowledge me. It's just a job, nothing special. But tonight, I stopped at the same old house. The house that always orders pizza at the strangest hours. It's so remote and isolated. It feels like it belongs to another universe. I've been here so many times I've lost count, but there's always been something off about it. I parked in front of the isolated house at the edge of town, stopping at the end of the gravel driveway, headlights illuminating the crumbling porch. The house looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. Overgrown grass, dusty windows, darkened by old curtains swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza box, and stepped up to the front door, knocking on the heavy wooden frame that echoed loudly. For a moment, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her faint smile barely lighting up her pale face, illuminated by dim light from inside. Yet her eyes were distant, unfocused, shadowed. "Here's your pizza," I said cheerfully, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. She reached out for the pizza box, her hand extending. But something about her hand caught my eye. As I handed it to her, I noticed bruises, dark, swollen marks on her pale skin, as if they'd been there for days. I froze for a second, standing there, unsure if I should say something, but decided against it. I quickly withdrew my hand and forced a smile. "Thanks," she mumbled, almost robotic, before pulling the pizza box inside and shutting the door. I got back in my car and sat for a moment, thinking. The rain kept pouring, and the world outside felt heavy. I couldn't shake the image of her trembling hand as she took the pizza box from me. But I drove away, trying to push it out of my mind. It was just a strange coincidence, I told myself. Weeks passed. Same routine. I delivered pizza to the same house every few days. I started to feel uneasy, my curiosity growing. One evening, after handing her the pizza, I hesitated and asked, "Excuse me? May I ask something?" But the woman only smiled faintly, shook her head, and closed the door, leaving me unsettled. Each time, the bruises and scratches on her hands seemed worse, this time even on her face, as if they had just healed and then reappeared. My instincts told me something was very wrong. Tonight, there was no regular order, but then I noticed something strange, a note hastily written in black ink taped to the door. It read, "Deliver to the back door. Knock 3 times, hard." I followed the instructions. This time, it wasn't her but a man. He stood there, bloodshot eyes, clearly intoxicated, his breath reeking of alcohol. He didn't say a word, just glared at me. I instinctively stepped back, trying to keep calm. He reached for the pizza box, snatched it from my hands, stepped inside and slammed the door shut. I left quickly. One evening, I drove past the house again, not to deliver this time, just passing by after my shift. My curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the house. In the second-floor window, a figure appeared behind the curtain, flashing a light 3 times, repeatedly, over and over. But then, I saw the shadow of a man behind her, raising his hand as if ready to strike. I froze for a moment. I sat in my car, unable to take my eyes off the house. Something inside me told me I needed to go back. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't ignore it. She needed help. After some thought, I returned to the house, planning to make up an excuse, saying it was a promotional gift for loyal customers. I felt I needed to see the woman again to make sure she was okay. The woman opened the door to pay, her eyes darting down to her hand as if she was deciding whether to say something. I followed her gaze. Then, her hand slowly moved down in an unusual way. She folded her thumb into her palm, then folded all her fingers down. At first, I didn't understand, but then I remembered learning about warning signals. It was the SOS hand signal for help. Before I could react or ask her what was happening, the man appeared behind her and shoved her back. He was still drunk, stumbling toward me with a dark, menacing expression. This time, his face had a fresh scratch, and his clothes were smeared with something unidentifiable, speckled with tiny dark spots. The man looked disoriented, his bloodshot eyes moving sluggishly. He mumbled something incoherent and slammed the door shut. At that moment, I froze in hesitation, unsure if this was my responsibility and whether I was putting myself in danger. Just as I was about to leave, the woman screamed from inside the house. "Help! Please!" Her voice was filled with fear. I dropped the pizza box, instincts kicking in, and rushed through the door without hesitation, quickly moving into the house. I knew a bit about self-defense. I had trained in martial arts for situations like this. As I stepped inside, a scene of chaos unfolded. It was horrifying. She was pinned to the floor, struggling under the man's weight, her face wet with tears, and her hands partially bound. Before I could move, the man charged at me in a fit of rage. But I anticipated the attack, ducked low, and countered with a strong strike to his side, sending him crashing to the floor in pain. Seizing the moment, I pinned him to the floor and used the rope he was tying the woman with to restrain him temporarily, long enough to keep him away from her. He was arrested shortly after, and the truth behind that house came to light. Her name was Angela. The man was her ex-husband. The two had gone through a court-ordered divorce. After she refused to reconcile with him, he kidnapped and tortured her, planning to force her into submission. His recent behavior was the result of a psychotic episode. His obsession turned deadly when she tried to escape. After the incident, I decided to quit my job, unwilling to continue such a dangerous line of work. Angela is now living a happy life with her daughter and her new husband. The price of the silent one. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I thought it was time to head home. I left the lab late one evening after a long day of experiments. The night was dark, the streets deserted, and the cold air biting at anyone daring to venture out. The road was empty, and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. As I drove, I suddenly noticed something moving by the roadside. A figure, a girl, walking alone in the desolation. She seemed disoriented, wearing a red coat, her head bowed, and her posture rigid, standing out under the dim light. Something about her felt off, so I slowed my car and came to a stop. I asked her if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" The girl didn't reply. She kept walking, her steps slow, as if she didn't even notice my presence. Finally, the girl stopped, and she slowly turned around. She had a beautiful face, but her skin was deathly pale, with an expression of anguish, as if she had forgotten how to smile forever. She asked for a ride and said she was on her way home. I politely hesitated at first, but then I agreed to give her a ride. I drove along the dark road as the girl sat silently in the back, staring out of the window. As I drove through the town, Approaching an old cemetery, the girl's behavior suddenly shifted. She began to grow increasingly agitated. Suddenly, she started clawing at the car window with her nails, screaming hysterically as if she were desperate to escape. She shouted, "Let me out! Let me out!" Panicked and unsure what was happening, I scrambled to unlock the door. She flung the car door open and bolted towards the cemetery. Her speed was unnatural, almost too fast, disappearing into the night. I got out of the car, calling after her, but she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the eerie silence of the darkness. Confused, I drove away, chalking the incident up as nothing more than a strange encounter. A few nights later, I drove home along the same route, but every night, something strange and puzzling happened. I encountered her again, asking for a ride. Each time as we neared the cemetery, she would scream, louder than before, and run into the darkness. It was like a looped tape, ending in terror every single time. My curiosity grew, and I began to wonder if I was witnessing something from another world. After 4 consecutive nights of experiencing the same bizarre encounter, I couldn't ignore her strange, repetitive behavior anymore. I was haunted by thoughts of what might be happening at the cemetery, and the image of her running remained etched in my mind. The next day, I decided to visit the cemetery to investigate. I began noticing the old, weathered gravestones, a strange sensation settling over me as I surveyed the area. After some searching, I stumbled upon a gravestone bearing the name Lydia Ward. What shocked me even more was the image on the grave. It was the girl who had asked for a ride. I was frozen in disbelief. Her date of death was engraved as 7 years ago. A chill ran down my spine as I read the words "killed" in a ritual. My mind began to spiral as the name and face felt eerily familiar. I couldn't shake the memory of another girl named Lydia. She had been killed in a satanic ritual. I realized that I might have been the one who witnessed her death all those years ago. When I was a student, I had taken part in a challenge to prove that demons weren't real and thought I was the only one at the cemetery. But suddenly, I was startled by the sound of a girl screaming. I followed the sound and discovered 3 men torturing a girl. I hid behind a bush to avoid being seen and watched as the men carried out what appeared to be some kind of satanic ritual. When the ritual ended, I thought it was over, or perhaps just a bizarre performance. Then, I saw the men sacrifice the girl, one of them holding a knife, attempting to take her life. I couldn't think of anything. I was terrified and quietly ran away. I acted like a coward, staying silent to avoid getting myself into trouble. My thoughts are now clouded by guilt and confusion. I was one of the last people to see Lydia alive. I feel responsible for not doing more, for not intervening when I saw her that day. I spent the next few days researching Lydia's death. I dug through old police records, spoke to former classmates, and visited the university archives. I discovered that Lydia's death was a tragic and mysterious event. Some students at the school had joined a cult-like group that conducted rituals in the cemetery, and Lydia was their victim. Although the police investigated, no one was convicted. My guilt grew as I realized that I had been there that day but was too afraid to intervene. Perhaps that's why her spirit has come to me. As I dug deeper into everything, I began experiencing strange occurrences. I constantly heard whispers in my home, and at night, Lydia appeared every night, standing at the foot of my bed with her sunken, sorrowful eyes, her mouth whispering softly. My room always felt cold, the air thick and heavy, as if her grief was pressing down on me. I began to wonder if Lydia's spirit was trying to tell me something. Perhaps her murder was tied to a larger conspiracy, and only I could uncover the truth. I returned to the cemetery. I felt her presence guiding me, leading me to a hidden spot behind an old mausoleum. I discovered numerous symbols etched onto the old stone walls and trees surrounding the cemetery. They resembled symbols used in ancient satanic rituals. My hands trembled as I took photos. The cult had used this place. Lydia had died here, sacrificed to summon whatever they worshipped. Piecing together everything I knew, I realized that Lydia's death was only part of a larger ritual that was taking place. The cult had used the lives of innocent people to summon dark forces, and Lydia was the final sacrifice. Overwhelmed by the truth, I knew I couldn't let this mystery remain hidden and unanswered any longer. I finally gathered enough evidence, photos, documents, symbols, to bring to the police and share what I had hidden and discovered. I knew that my actions were the only way to free her soul. The police finally launched a comprehensive investigation into the cult's activities, arresting several former students and members who had participated in the rituals. In the end, justice was served for Lydia, and her soul could finally rest after 7 years of torment. In the final moments, I visited Lydia's grave once more. This time, as I stood before her grave, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. By uncovering the truth, I had redeemed myself, and now I could let go of the guilt that had haunted me for so long. As Rick turned to leave, he glanced back and saw a figure standing in the distance, Lydia's red coat billowing in the wind. He smiled softly, knowing she was no longer trapped, but finally free. The haunting of invisible ghosts. His name was Henry, and he always enjoyed taking late-night walks. There was something about the stillness that made everything feel simpler. It had been this way for years, a nightly routine for him and his dog, Boss. Henry had been a welder for over 40 years. Now, he was living alone on this large farm. The house, too big for just one person, had felt empty ever since Maria, his wife, passed away. Henry's children had moved out long ago, and after cancer took his wife's life, it was just Henry, left alone with the memories. Tonight, after a long day, Henry decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing, and his dog Boss trotted beside him, his nose sniffing the ground as if searching for something. As Henry made the loop around the house, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the second-story window. The bedroom window, the one that belonged to Maria. Henry stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, something or someone moving inside. Henry's heart raced, not believing his eyes. He hadn't set foot in that room for years, let alone let anyone else in. Henry stared up at the window, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, Boss close behind, and stormed up the stairs 2 at a time. When Henry reached the bedroom, the door creaked open slowly. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. Henry's eyes scanned the space, nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. Henry felt foolish for overreacting, but that unease, that creeping sensation, stayed with him. Something had been there, Henry was sure of it. The next night, Boss's low growl woke Henry from a deep sleep. He sat up, listening, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. That's when he heard the creaking of floorboards. Henry's first instinct was to grab his rifle, and he moved into the hallway, raising the gun. A dark figure stood at the end of the hall. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her hand stretched toward him, fingers unnaturally long. Another night passed. Henry came downstairs early in the morning, only to find the kitchen lights on. He remembered turning them off. Henry grew tense and started calling the police. They searched the entire house, even bringing in the K-9 unit, but nothing turned up. Henry could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but he knew something was wrong. That was the last straw. The next night, Henry went back upstairs. He didn't know what compelled him to return, but when he opened the door, the sight nearly stopped his heart. Maria's clothes, which Henry had packed away after she died, were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had pulled them out, Panic rose in his throat. Henry staggered back, and that's when he saw her. A figure stood in the doorway. A woman, but it wasn't Maria. Henry couldn't make out her face, but she was shorter, thinner. Someone he didn't recognize, and her presence filled him with dread. Before he could react, she ran, disappearing down the stairs and into the night. Henry chased her to the front yard, but she was gone by the time he made it outside. Bosley and Henry searched the property, but there was no trace of her. Henry didn't sleep that night. In fact, he hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside it all felt like her, lurking, waiting to return. Henry kept his rifle close, afraid he might actually have to use it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Henry was sitting in the living room, trying to distract himself with the television when he saw her. She was standing in the yard, staring at Henry through the window, just a shadow, silhouetted by the moonlight. Henry grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling, and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. She turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing once again. The shots had probably scared her off for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The next day, after Henry had been out for errands and returned home late, he didn't see Boss greet him. He searched every corner of the house, but everything felt empty. But Henry still had one last room to check, Maria's room. He stumbled into the bedroom, the door creaking open. Maria's clothes were no longer scattered across the floor. They were neatly hung. But what Henry dreaded had come to pass. The woman was still there, sitting on the bed, staring at him. Her eyes gleamed, and she smiled a cold, twisted smile. She whispered that she had been waiting for him. Henry froze, shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That voice, it was Maria's. But something was wrong. It was cold, hollow. Before Henry could react, her face shifted from an indistinct blur to something grotesque, her skin melting into a monstrous form. The skin peeled away, revealing rotting flesh underneath. Her eyes sank into her skull, her mouth gaping in a horrifying grimace. Henry screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. She lunged at him, and as darkness engulfed him, her fingers seemed to scratch and penetrate his chest. The haunting of invisible ghosts. Henry slowly woke up with a strange feeling, something rough rubbing against his face. It took a moment for Henry to open his eyes and realize it was Boss licking his face. Henry remembered the last time he couldn't find his dog, but after everything that happened, seeing Boss made him feel more at ease. Henry groaned, his whole body aching as he struggled to sit up. Everything felt too stiff, the joints rigid, and the muscles dull with pain, as if she had actually lunged at him, clawing and piercing into his flesh. Boss whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Henry glanced over and saw nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something strange was inside his own home. Days passed in a vague exhaustion. Every night, it was the same. Boss sat in front of the bedroom door, staring, ears pricked up as if waiting for something. Then, like clockwork, at that exact hour, he would start barking, the sound echoing throughout the house, jolting Henry from his restless sleep. He would get up, gun in hand, and search the house, but he never found anything. The house remained silent, the darkness unchanged. He tried to convince himself that it was just Boss being protective, or perhaps reacting to something normal outside. One night, the barking started again, more intense than ever. He jumped up, hurried down the stairs, gun at the ready, and froze at the sight before him. There, near the living room window, Mari was standing. Her face was gentle, hair flowing in the wind. Henry was paralyzed, an uncontrollable feeling swelling within him. Henry hadn't seen her in years. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of comfort. Boss fell silent, his barking turning into a faint whimper, as if something wasn't quite right ahead. He slowly approached the window, but then something changed. Henry stepped back as Mari's gentle form began to fade, her features distorting as if cracking horribly, her joints twisting grotesquely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to darken, sinking into her face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing sharp teeth, with black slime oozing through the cracks in her face. He suddenly realized she had come, perhaps deceiving him and appearing in the form of Mari's spirit. He knew that couldn't be his wife. The figure by the window vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Henry rushed outside, desperately searching for her, or it, whatever he had just seen. He circled the house, calling for Mari, as if somehow she might still be there, but there was no one. As Henry turned the corner of the barn, he suddenly felt an icy chill. The world around him seemed to shift. The night grew unnaturally dark. It felt like the darkness was swallowing the farm. He heard a whisper, soft and mocking.
Henry.
It was her voice, but distorted and broken, drawing him toward the barn. Henry pushed open the barn door, and there she was again, Mari standing motionless. The whispers grew louder around him.
Come home, Henry. It's time.
The voice echoed from every direction. The darkness closed in, pulling him to his knees as if hypnotized to obey. Her form began to twist again, skin peeling away, revealing a skeletal grid beneath. The barn door slammed shut behind Henry with a piercing noise, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The air filled with voices chanting Henry's name, full of malice. He stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him plunging into a deep, cold pit. He landed hard on a damp surface. Henry reeled from the overwhelming stench of decay, and as he looked around, rotting corpses, with sunken eyes, stared back at him. He tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were slick. The bodies began to move, their skeletal hands reaching out, grabbing Henry's legs, pulling him down. A grotesque figure emerged from the darkness above. It was her again, a monstrous version of Mari. Limbs elongated, her smile impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth.
Henry, it's time to join us,
she said. Then suddenly, Henry found himself in Mari's old room. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against his skin.
You can't escape, Henry.
He felt an unnatural pressure tightening around his neck, and he couldn't move. As his vision darkened, it was slowly taking control of him. The first light of dawn crept over the farm. The house lay still and cold, its windows dark and empty. Boss lingered on the porch, his mournful howl echoing across the silent fields. No one knew what really happened. Henry was gone, or perhaps he was still there, but no longer himself. Vengeance of the Soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The killer became nothing more than a memory, consumed by the very spirit he had created. The terror on Christmas Eve. This incident happened on Christmas Eve, the year Lena was 13. Since she only lived with her dad, and her family usually either didn't celebrate or celebrated Christmas late, she was used to this. For Lena, Christmas Eve was just like any other night. Her dad was a doctor, so he always had to be on call at the hospital during Christmas holidays. That night was no exception. He wasn't home. Lena was watching TV when she heard a knock at the door, so she went to see who it was. Her front door had a peephole, making it easy to see who was outside. A man stood outside wearing a Santa Claus suit, holding a bag and smiling, waving at Lena to open the door. But something about him seemed off. He didn't look neat at all. Lena approached the door, but didn't open it. She found it odd that someone dressed as Santa Claus would come to her house, of all the houses in the neighborhood. He said,
"Hey kid, it's me, Santa Claus. Let me in, and I'll show you."
Maybe other kids would believe him, but Lena knew he wasn't real. Confused and skeptical, because this had never happened before, Lena refused to open the door. The man insisted, saying he had changed the rules this year to give gifts to kids in the neighborhood. But Lena didn't believe him. Instead, she remembered feeling angry while arguing with him. Lena told him she was calling the police. His smile disappeared, and after that, she didn't hear anything else. To be sure, Lena called the police to report him. Unfortunately, they probably didn't believe her and thought she was just an excited kid, hoping Santa Claus would visit. She only knew how to dial 911 and the house number, since it was the 90s and her dad didn't have a mobile phone yet. Lena could only hope the man wouldn't return. But a few minutes later, someone knocked again. When Lena checked, no one was there. She returned to the Christmas tree to continue decorating and wrapping gifts as a surprise for her dad. Lena turned on the TV to watch Christmas specials, which made her feel less lonely. Suddenly, the power went out, leaving the house in darkness. Lena jumped in fright. Now, the only light in the house came from the battery-operated Christmas tree. Then she heard the back door creak open. From the doorway emerged a dark silhouette, slowly advancing. It was the figure of a man. Lena grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and shone it towards the figure. The face revealed was his, the man from earlier, leaning close to her with a sinister grin.
Here's your surprise gift, little one.
He sneered. Lena screamed and ran toward the back door, but she couldn't outrun him. He grabbed her hand and yanked her back. Lena sobbed and screamed, begging for mercy, but he showed no remorse. He taped her mouth shut and began tying her up with rope. As her vision blurred, he stuffed her into a large sack he had brought with him and hoisted it over his shoulder. Lena's next-door neighbor, who was walking his dog, happened to see the man. His actions seemed suspicious. The neighbor remembered that Lena lived alone with her father, who was often away, and her father had occasionally asked him to check on her. He cautiously approached with his dog and asked,
"What are you doing out here at this hour? Is everything okay?"
The man, startled, quickly forced a smile and replied,
Oh, I'm just preparing a surprise for the kids in the neighborhood.
The man hurriedly hid the sack behind his back, stepping away as his eyes darted around. His strange behavior only heightened the neighbor's suspicions. His dog kept barking, as if trying to warn him of something. It was a smart dog, good at sensing trouble. The neighbor noticed the sack behind the man seemed to be moving slightly. Sensing the man was odd, the neighbor remained cautious. He apologized for bothering him and pretended to head back toward his house. He then heard a faint sound resembling crying and immediately knew something was wrong. Without thinking, he rushed toward the man and shoved him hard, causing him to fall onto the grass. The sack fell, and Lena tumbled out onto the grass, her eyes wide with terror. The man tried to flee, but the neighbor quickly pinned him to the ground and held him there until the police arrived. The man remained on the ground, handcuffed and arrested. Lena was safely escorted back home by her neighbor. Her father returned home immediately after hearing the news. That night, Lena learned the true meaning of fear. She hugged her father tightly, knowing she was lucky to have survived a terrifying Christmas Eve. The echo of the forgotten sonata. Silver Hollow was known for its quiet streets, friendly faces, and a sense of safety. But the highway just outside its borders told a different story. For months, drivers had vanished without a trace, and rumors of a masked figure haunting the lonely stretch of road began to spread. Locals whispered about this mysterious stalker, but no one had seen him close enough to describe. Nick Hollis, an investigator, was assigned to go undercover as a long-haul truck driver to uncover the truth behind these mysterious disappearances. Nick was skeptical. A wholesome-looking town like Silver Hollow didn't seem like the hiding place of a serial killer. He didn't know if the road and the small town were connected, but highways didn't lie, and the rising number of disappearances demanded answers. Although he lived in the town, he had never noticed anything strange about it. Most people were genuinely kind. His cover was simple: a new truck driver passing through the area, taking odd routes to make a living. He disguised himself and rented a small apartment on the edge of town. During the day, Nick observed the locals, casually chatting at diners or gas stations. Everyone was polite, almost overly friendly, as if trying to erase any doubt. But unease settled in at night as the highway stretched endlessly into darkness, lit only by the occasional flicker of headlights. It was Nick's third night on the highway. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road, briefly illuminated by the truck's headlights. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. His mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the roadside. As the flashlight swept across the ground, Nick spotted something wedged under a nearby rock, a crumpled piece of paper. He hesitated, then stepped forward and bent down to pick it up. The paper read, "Turn back. You won't find them alive." A chill ran down his spine. He swept the flashlight across the area again, but saw no one. Nick hurried back to his truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, but all he saw was the dark highway stretching behind him. The note felt like a warning, and Nick knew he couldn't ignore it. The following night, Nick parked his truck at a small rest stop along the highway to get a better vantage point. Around 2 a.m., he noticed a car with its lights off creeping along the road, as if trying to avoid detection. Nick started his truck and followed from a distance. The car turned onto a dense, overgrown path leading away from the highway. Nick parked nearby, grabbed his binoculars, and observed. A masked man stepped out of the car, dragging a heavy-looking bag. He disappeared into the trees. Nick's instincts kicked in, and he quietly followed on foot, keeping his distance. After a few minutes, he spotted the man crouched by a small fire, rummaging through the bag's contents, wallets, phones, and jewelry. Nick crept closer, careful not to make a sound. His plan was to observe long enough to identify the man and his habits, then report back. But as he moved, a twig snapped under his foot. The masked man said,
Who's there?
Nick raised his hands in surrender.
Just a truck driver passing through. Got lost.
The masked man stood up, holding a knife.
This road isn't for wandering. You should leave.
He muttered before vanishing into the woods. Nick immediately called for backup, and a quick search of the area uncovered a stash of stolen goods. 2 days later, the masked man was caught and identified as a petty thief who had been robbing and extorting travelers. Nick's instincts told him this man wasn't responsible for the disappearances. The thief's petty crimes were nothing compared to the horrors the missing travelers had faced. After capturing the masked thief on the highway, Nick couldn't shake the unease in his mind. The petty thief's words echoed in his memory. The real monster isn't dumb enough to get caught. He started noticing inconsistencies. A house with windows perpetually shut. A place he often passed but never saw anyone. Upon investigation, he realized it was his cousin Derek's house, who lived on the town's outskirts. Derek had always been approachable, someone Nick trusted. But during a casual visit to Derek's house, Nick sensed something was off. Derek's home was cozy, adorned with old family photos, and faintly smelled of wood. While chatting over coffee, Nick's sharp detective instincts picked up on strange details. Scratches on the floor near a cabinet, an unusual lock on the basement door, and a faint metallic scent in the air. While Derek excused himself to take a call, Nick wandered through the living room, his curiosity growing. A framed photo on the mantel caught his attention. It was a picture of Derek standing with a group of locals, including a man reported missing months ago. That night, Nick pretended to leave but parked his truck nearby, watching. Using his lock-picking skills, Nick snuck around the back and gently opened the door. Nick opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The stench hit him first, a nauseating mix of damp earth and decay. The dim light from a single bulb revealed a chilling scene. Rows of Polaroids were pinned to the walls, some showing missing persons from case files, all in varying states of fear and distress. A bloodied tarp covered something large on the floor. Nearby were necklaces, wallets, and torn jackets scattered carelessly. The basement resembled something out of a nightmare. Rows of industrial freezers lined the walls, each labeled with dates and names. A workbench was filled with surgical tools, knives meticulously arranged. As Nick turned to leave, he heard footsteps above. Derek's voice rang out, calm but chilling.
You weren't supposed to see this, Nick.
Derek appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a shotgun, his face devoid of its usual warmth. He revealed his twisted reasoning, claiming he was protecting the town by ensuring no locals came to harm. Knowing he couldn't reach his concealed weapon, Nick noticed a toolbox on a nearby shelf. Inside, he spotted a flashlight with a cracked lens and a reflective object sticking out of the corner, an old mirror. He began forming a plan. Nick stepped back toward the toolbox, feigning nervous compliance.
At least let me clean up the mess I've made, Derek. Let me pull the tarp back.
As Nick knelt to adjust the tarp, he discreetly grabbed the mirror from the toolbox. Using the flashlight's cracked lens to create a distraction, he angled the mirror to reflect the light from the overhead bulb. Nick raised the flashlight, aiming it at Derek. The cracked lens split the beam, momentarily blinding and distracting him with a sudden burst of light. As Derek instinctively stepped back, Nick lunged toward a nearby shelf, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The heavy cans tumbled down, causing Derek to stagger and drop the shotgun. Nick slammed the basement door shut and locked it from the outside, using a nearby chair to block the handle. Wasting no time, he pulled out his phone and called for backup. Authorities arrested Derek and seized the horrifying evidence from the basement. Inside the freezers were packages labeled as meat, but peeling back the layers revealed severed hands and feet, meticulously wrapped and disturbingly labeled. Even as the case was closed, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness of Silver Hollow ran deeper than his cousin's monstrous deeds. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Nee, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Nee walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine, since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nye found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
Who's there?
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nye heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance. Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nee realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nee studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, "M when the piano begins to play, You must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Nee swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nee sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nee's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nee realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place,
he cried out, his voice laced with agony. Nee played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Nee found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Nee collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Nee didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. Stranger in the dark. My family was excited about the trip to my aunt's house. I had always looked forward to spending time with my cousin Luca, my closest companion. We arrived at my aunt's house, surrounded by towering trees. Luca rushed outside, her face lighting up when she saw us. After a while, we headed to the nearby store, eager to grab snacks for movie night. We excitedly filled our hands with treats. As we were about to walk home, a man called out to us. I turned around to see a well-dressed man holding a bag of chips. He smiled warmly, and instinctively, I moved closer. The man handed me the bag of chips, and his friendly demeanor put me at ease. I thanked him and walked away without giving it much thought. Night fell, and the atmosphere in the house changed. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by snacks, as we prepared to watch a movie. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I exchanged a worried glance with Luca, asking if she had locked the door. She hesitated, unsure, and decided to check. The weight felt unbearable as I stood there. My anxiety grew, and I got up to see why she was taking so long. As I stepped into the hallway, my heart stopped. Luca was lying unconscious on the floor, and a masked man was standing next to her. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I staggered back, feeling paralyzed with fear. The man noticed me and rushed forward. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it just as I heard him pounding on it. I glanced back at the door, the man's pounding echoing in my ears. I couldn't leave Luca behind, even though fear gripped me. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a plate from the kitchen rack. When the noise outside stopped, I slowly opened the door for a peek. Suddenly, the door burst open, knocking me back. I managed to swing the plate toward him in desperation. It shattered on his head, fragments flying everywhere. Blood streamed from the wound as he staggered back, dazed. I rushed into the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. I tried to dial for help, but I couldn't press the buttons. I was too shaken, not knowing what to do. I ran to check on Luca. I splashed water on her face, and after a moment she woke up. Confusion replacing her unconscious state. Relief washed over me, but I knew we weren't safe yet. When I heard the man stirring, a cold wave of fear swept over me. I couldn't let him find us. I whispered to Luca that we needed to hide. We crept into the kitchen and hid behind the counter. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. I peeked out and saw him searching for us, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's hunger. Fear suffocated me as I gripped Luca's hand tightly. I heard him coming closer, his footsteps making my stomach churn. The sound stopped, and for a moment, silence blanketed the house. Then the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Suddenly, I shuddered as a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned around, and it was Luca, her eyes wide with fear. I could barely see the silhouette of the man in the darkness. Instinctively, I crept forward again, pulling Luca toward the back door, where the faint moonlight streamed in. We dashed outside, running frantically toward the trees that surrounded my aunt's property. We heard the man's laughter echoing through the trees, sending chills down my spine. We spotted a narrow path ahead, leading deeper into the woods. We had no other choice. The path opened up to a cliff overlooking a dark abyss. Panic surged inside me. There was nowhere left to run. Luca and I slowly backed away, but the man kept coming closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling. He lunged at us, and instinctively, I pushed Luca aside. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and held it out, ready to defend us. The man laughed, unfazed by my feeble weapon. He lunged again, but this time I dodged to the side. In the chaos, the man stumbled, losing his balance at the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as I watched him teeter on the brink, his expression shifting from confidence to panic. He flailed, reaching out into the air. With one last gasp, he slipped and fell off the cliff, his scream fading into the night. Luca and I stood frozen, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Finally, we followed the path back home. We rushed back home, locking the door behind us. I collapsed onto the chair, trembling, while Luca sat next to me, her eyes wide in disbelief. I realized the gravity of everything and decided to call the police about the horrifying events. I felt grateful because just a little more, and we could have lost everything. The town's haunted mystery. It was during one of our arguments, moving from yelling to an uncomfortable silence. Kira suggested, almost hesitantly, maybe we just need to leave. Start somewhere new. She stared at the wall, her voice trembling. I thought differently. I didn't believe a change of scenery would solve anything, but despair hung thick in the air between us. We'd gone through endless nonsense for months, arguing over small things like dishes left in the sink or unwashed clothes, which then escalated into intense fights. Our little daughter, Lily, would stand in the corner, clutching her toy, her eyes sad as if she understood more than we realized. The arguments became unbearable, and I felt as though our family was crumbling day by day. The drive to our new town was filled with silence. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow on the horizon as we traded one skyline for endless fields. I cracked the window, breathing in fresh air, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Kira smiled at me, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Eventually, we drove up to our new house. It was a small, cozy old building nestled among others on the street. As we unpacked, I felt a flicker of hope. It was the first time I saw her. Margaret, an elderly woman in a sweater and long skirt, stood on the sidewalk. She waved as she saw us, holding a plate of cookies to welcome us to the neighborhood. As we exchanged pleasantries, I noticed a girl standing behind Margaret, around Lily's age but with a troubling paleness. Then she complimented my daughter. I replied, trying to smile politely, but something about Margaret felt strange. Her enthusiasm was odd. Suddenly, she turned serious, mentioning a certain well. She began to tell me about a wishing well in town, urging me to bring Lily there, assuring me she would love it. A wishing well. I found it rather strange, like a local legend from where I lived. She said it would bring luck to anyone who made a wish and tossed in a coin, a tradition spanning generations. The conversation made me uncomfortable. Kira shrugged, but I felt a chill as I watched Margaret leave, the girl following her like a shadow. In the days that followed, the town felt like a breath of fresh air. The change in atmosphere worked wonders for our family. Kira and I argued less, and Lily seemed to thrive in the open space of our new home. The townsfolk were friendly and laid back. Yet, the well kept coming up in conversation. I overheard a cashier mention it, saying, "The well changed my life." At work, my coworkers talked about it as if it were some sort of miracle. Finally, one night, I mentioned it to Kira, about everyone's obsession with this well. She just thought it was probably one of their local traditions. But the unease grew heavier. The atmosphere at work changed, my hours were cut, and coworkers became distant. It felt like something was pressing down on us, suffocating us. Kira's mood turned dark, and we argued over trivial things again. One night, I was wandering through the forest. I stumbled upon the well. It stood ominously in a clearing, its stone walls oddly slick. I could feel the weight of the town's tradition pulling me back. What if I made a wish? Desperation clawed within me. I approached the well, heart pounding. I had nothing left to lose. I pulled a quarter from my pocket, thinking of my family, of needing things to get better. I tossed the coin in, wishing for things to improve. A silence fell over me as I turned to leave. At that moment, Margaret appeared, her smile wide and unsettling. "You made a wish, didn't you?" I nodded, feeling a mix of hope and dread rising within me. She simply said, "It will come true," and then smiled, walking away. The next morning, I woke up to the familiar warmth in bed. Kira lay beside me, her face peaceful. I glanced around, feeling a weight lift from my chest. I had a strange feeling of hope, as though everything was falling back into place. Breakfast was a cheerful event, laughter filling the room. It felt like the burdens of the past had been lifted. We were happy, almost too happy. But a small part of me felt something wasn't quite right. And everything from that day began that night. While lying in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling of insecurity. Something is wrong. Lily's scream broke the silence, and I rushed to my child's room. Lily trembled, her eyes wide open in fear as she cried and pointed to me that there was a monster in the window. I hurried to the window, pulled back the curtains, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street and the trees. What is happening? I whispered to myself, feeling panic rise within me. I turned back to Lily, who was still staring at the window, pale and terrified. I stood frozen, trying to comfort her in my arms, though the unease gnawed at me. I stayed up late that night, with Lily between Kira and me. Kira, exhausted from sleepless nights, drifted off, leaving me on high alert. The following days were a chaotic mix of anxiety and paranoia. Lily's nightmares became a nightly occurrence, and each time, I found myself jolted awake by her screams. I tried to distract myself with errands around town, but whispers seemed to follow me everywhere I went. The locals had hollow smiles, with something in their eyes I couldn't quite identify. It felt like the whole town was watching me. Everything will be fine. a cheerful cashier said as I bought groceries, but her smile felt like a mask hiding something sinister. Just make a wish by the well. I never wanted this nightmare. I never wanted my family involved in any twisted game. One evening, after another night of Lily's screams, I found myself back at the well, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. The air was tense as I approached, Margaret's words echoing in my mind. As I stood there, I noticed the well's surface glistening under the moonlight, almost inviting me. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The chill of the night air made me shiver. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched washed over me once again. I felt a presence lurking in the darkness, and panic took over. I ran home, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. Kira was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I quickly ran to Lily's room to check on her and saw she was fast asleep. But when I looked closer, I noticed a thin layer of sweat on her forehead. Something wasn't right. I went back to Kira, pacing the floor, my mind spinning. We need to do something. This can't keep happening. Kira's gaze was distant, lost in thought. She said to me, "Maybe we should leave. We could pack up and go somewhere else." "No," I snapped stubbornly, feeling the weight of despair. "We can't keep running. We need to find a way to fix this." That night, I decided to confront Margaret. I needed to know the truth. With my heart racing, I left the house and headed to hers. As I approached, the atmosphere changed. I knocked on the door, fear rising within me. She greeted me with a smile that seemed friendly, but it didn't feel genuine at all. I desperately told her I needed to know what was happening. Her expression turned serious, her eyes narrowing. "You know, wishes come with consequences," she said softly. Leaning closer, "You wished for things to be better, but what if there's a cost?" I felt myself unraveling as she kept talking about what I had lost. She tilted her head, that predatory smile returning. "It's not always clear. Sometimes you get what you wish for by sacrificing something else, something precious." I stumbled back, wondering if I had traded my daughter's happiness for a hollow life. When I returned home, I found Lily in her room, but she wasn't the girl I once knew. Laughter seemed to have been replaced by an eerie silence. She looked at me with hollow eyes, like an empty shell. Regret weighed heavily on me. I had wanted to fix everything, but I had only made it worse, foolishly believing in something dark and twisted. I returned to the well, desperate to undo my wish. I knelt by the edge, staring into the darkness. I want my daughter back. I didn't want this to happen, but the well remained silent. Days passed, and our home became like a prison as Lily worsened, her strange behaviors leaving me helpless and heartbroken, unsure of what to do. Every time I went outside, those around me kept smiling, but their eyes hid a secret, a dark truth I could never grasp. They too had made their wishes, and I was just another pawn in their game. In the end, I made a decision. I would play the game, just like Margaret had. I would find another family and make them wish, too, to replace my daughter. As I walked through the town, I spotted a family moving in down the street, a young couple with a little girl who looked just like Lily. I approached them, a smile spreading across my face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, hiding the darkness within. And no, with a new cast in the pipeline. Maybe the darkness had clouded my vision and taken over. I didn't know when this would end or if there was any escape. The girl looked up, her eyes bright and full of life, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Perhaps I had to be the villain, to save my daughter, my family. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, My steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
Are you sure about this, son?
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. It's just a train ride. I'll be back. The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us. Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Hi. I frowned. Who was this? I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. You don't know who this is? I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound, a knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. I'm here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
Here, help me.
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask, the wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move, and he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. The Blonde Girl. This is a story that happened a long time ago when I visited my local library. I have always been drawn to the lonely silence of old libraries. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old paper and dust, and the walls were lined with towering bookshelves that. I remember that I went there to borrow a few educational books. The internet existed at that time, but you couldn't just Google anything you wanted to know. The more conventional method for me was to go to the library and check out books on the subjects I was interested in. Anyway, I drove to the library, which was only about a 5-minute drive from my house. I walked in just as the library was about to close. I thought I was the only one in the library. As I walked through the aisles, my footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. The daylight outside was fading, casting long, strange shadows through the narrow windows. The library was quite large, and I headed to the section of books I was looking for. I felt immersed there. The silence was pleasant, only occasionally broken by the rustle of turning pages. I started looking for the best books to borrow. I spent a few minutes browsing and comparing the books. As evening approached, I decided to look at a particularly intriguing book I had found on spirituality, the supernatural, and horror. It was the only one on the shelf, and I picked it up. Some passages of the book talked about a blonde girl who had been brutally murdered, horrifically, by ancient cursed legends. She was like a sacrificial offering. Just as I was about to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her, a blonde girl standing in the far corner of the library. She was partially obscured by the shadows, the light fading dimly. There was something unsettling about her presence, an eerie silence that seemed to absorb all sound around her. She seemed almost out of place. This woman appeared quite young, with blonde hair, wearing a polka dot headband as if from many decades ago. My heart began to race. The girl didn't move, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, unsure whether to call out to her or quietly leave. As I watched, the girl took a few small, slow steps forward, revealing a pale, emotionless face. Her eyes were dark voids, empty and soulless. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. The girl took one step closer, then another, moving silently across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She moved closer, her movements deliberate and haunting. When she was just a few meters away, she stopped and tilted her head to one side. as if studying me. Finally, I found the strength to move. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving hers. The girl remained still, staring at me with her empty, terrifying gaze. I turned and hurried towards the exit, clutching the book tightly. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the library. Then, suddenly, whispers grew louder, as if speaking directly into my ear, a mixture of voices seeming to come from everywhere. I looked around frantically but saw no one, and I couldn't determine their source. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like an abandoned house. As I fled, the whispers followed, growing more insistent. Panicking, I turned back, but the door had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of bookshelves. The whispers were now deafening. I clutched the ancient book to my chest. I could see her clearly. The girl stood just inside the threshold, her black eyes sewn shut. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, as if cursing. Her face was grotesquely distorted, and she was holding a box containing something that looked like two eyes. I reached for the door and flung it open, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. As I made my way to the exit, I glanced back one last time. In the corner where the girl had stood, I saw a lock of blonde hair lying on the floor, glinting in the sunlight. The whispers had vanished, but the haunting feeling remained, a reminder that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I never spoke of what I saw that night. Sometimes, as I lay in bed, I was reminded not to mention the girl. She would scream, tears that couldn't fall because she had no eyes. If I spoke, she would be in danger for being exposed. Perhaps we had made a spiritual connection. She looked so pitiful. I didn't know what else to do but go to the church and pray for her. 2 months later, the dreams began to fade, and I rarely saw her in my sleep anymore. Perhaps it was a good thing for her. The Weirdo at the Pizza Shop. I am a manager at a pizza shop. It was a typical Tuesday night at the place where I work. We were getting ready to wrap up for the night, and the last customers were finishing their meals. But then, the doorbell chimed, and Brad walked in a customer everyone feared. He was a huge man, weighing hundreds of kilograms. As he entered, a foul stench began to fill the air in the shop. He shuffled over to a table in the corner and ordered a few of our largest deep dish pizzas. Tonight was no different, except for the small cooler he brought with him. He placed it on the table with a thud that echoed through the shop. I asked him, "What's in the cooler, Brad?" He grinned at me, revealing yellow teeth, and said it was just some sides he brought along. We don't really allow outside food to avoid any trouble, so I just told him not to make a mess. He took out his food and started eating. Even from where I was, it looked disturbing the way he ate. Even from that distance, I could hear the slurping, the chomping, the way he devoured the food like a man possessed. When I finally mustered the courage to bring out his first pizza, the stench hit me. It was emanating from his cooler, like something rotten. Inside the plastic bags were chunks of meat. I told him he couldn't eat, that it must have gone bad. Then he suddenly took out a grayish lump and started gnawing on it. With relish, it looked like raw meat. As the hours passed, things got more unsettling. He kept ordering pizza after pizza, his appetite seemingly insatiable. The few remaining customers fled in horror at the sight of Brad. For a brief moment, I thought he was finally done, but he wasn't. He motioned for me to come over, his face glistening with grease and sauce, making my skin crawl. He held up the bag of meat and asked for it to be warmed up. I stepped back, feeling uneasy, but agreed and put it on a tray. I hurried it over to the microwave. The stench filled the kitchen as the microwave started. When it beeped, I hesitated to open it, terrified of what I might find inside. As the steam cleared, I saw an unmistakable shape among the chunks of meat. It was a human ear, shriveled and grotesque. I panicked. I was about to call the police when I heard a scream from the dining area. I rushed out and found Nana, my assistant, clutching her arm, blood streaming down it. She was trembling with pain and fear, saying that Brad had bitten her. I looked over to where Brad had been sitting, and for some reason, he was lying on the floor amid a mess of leftover food. Brad was gasping for air. His shirt had torn open, and his belly was distended in a grotesque way. The buttons on his shirt were slowly popping open. He still tried to crawl toward another slice of pizza, but something was wrong. His belly was swelling, looking like it was about to burst. He collapsed, face first into the pizza, his body convulsing once before going still. His last words were, "So hungry," which sent everyone in the room screaming in terror. I called the police and asked them to handle the situation with Brad. His death was officially ruled as natural causes due to overeating, but I knew the truth. What he had been eating was likely far more horrifying. A lot happened all at once. My shop had to close for several days, and every time I think about it, I feel a chill of horror. Mysterious treehouse. Through the dense foliage, the silhouette of a massive, weathered treehouse emerged. The house was large, its wooden structure warped and covered in vines. The treehouse seemed forgotten by time, hidden by the surrounding forest. We had been walking for hours through the forest, the trees becoming denser the deeper we went. Everything started with my friend Cody's dog. Oddly, it had gone missing for 5 days, then returned home with a strange piece of paper in its mouth. The paper looked like a toy treasure map, so I was intrigued. Cody started climbing the ladder nailed to the tree, and from above, he called down to me, telling me to hurry up and see something. I hesitated for a moment because the house seemed suspicious and strange, but I decided to follow Cody. I slowly climbed the rickety ladder to the treehouse. The closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Now, I could see the house more clearly. Through the broken windows, I could see inside the house. It was a mess, full of dust and scattered objects, yet it felt oddly alive. It was like a place of exile. The air inside the treehouse was stifling, thick with dust and an unpleasant stench. I began to look around and noticed the mess, tattered old clothes scattered across the floor. In one corner, there was a mattress, stained with something black and terrible. As we moved further in, we saw the glimpse of a large, rusted iron cage among the debris. It seemed like no one had been here for years. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and told Cody.
"There's nothing here. We should leave."
But Cody wouldn't listen. He was rummaging near the cage, curious, when suddenly he froze. His eyes widened, and his face turned pale as he said,
We need to go. Now.
Before I could ask what happened, I heard it, a voice from below, low and raspy, full of malice. Well, look who I found. I glanced out the window. A man was standing at the base of the tree, looking up at us with a sinister grin. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair long and dirty, as if he had been living in the forest for too long. Cody wasted no time and shouted,
My dad's a cop. He's coming any minute.
The man's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed as he started to threaten that if we were lying, he wouldn't spare us. Cody was below, near the ladder, ready to run, but I was stuck because the rope ladder behind his house was about to break. If he comes up here, I won't have anywhere to go. I backed away from the window, inching closer to where the cage appeared in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My back hit the cold metal of the cage, and I felt something move behind me. Something alive. I slowly turned around. Inside the cage, huddled in the shadows, was a person, but it looked more like a monster. Its skeletal frame was twisted and deformed, with ashen gray skin. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild. The creature stirred, its head slowly rising as it turned towards me, opening its mouth and reaching out as if to attack. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. Cody called me out of there immediately, and without thinking, I rushed towards the ladder in front of the house, decided to climb down regardless of what was waiting for me down there. Courageous Cody used his entire body to stop that crazy guy from running towards me. Cody said run to my parents, and they'll know what to do. I'm worried, and he's behind. He told me to go quickly and come back. I followed the instructions and ran as fast as I could. I have to save him. Cody stayed behind, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. When the police arrived, everything was gone, and there was no trace of anyone. 10 years have passed since that day. I never went back to the treehouse until now. The memories came flooding back as I stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the towering oak where the treehouse still stood, weathered and decaying. The uninvited guest. Ava and her fiancé, Jay, decided to host a dinner party to celebrate his mother's recovery. The house was bustling with final touches on the decorations, ensuring everything was ready. She had hired a server to assist her in serving their family and friends. The server arrived on time as scheduled. As soon as he walked in, Ava noticed an unpleasant odor coming from him, which made her uncomfortable, especially since he would be preparing food for her family, but she forced a polite smile. As the server unpacked his utensils, he kept glancing at Ava, asking for her opinion on spices, telling her to taste the food, and seeking her input on presentation. But she politely said she trusted his taste, as he was the chef after all. Soon it was 5:45 p.m. Guests were about to arrive, yet he was still there. After reminding him twice, she bluntly told him she needed him to finish everything and be out by 6 o'clock. He apologized, claiming her oven wasn't maintaining the right temperature, a problem Ava had never encountered before. As guests started arriving, the server finally began packing up his things, but instead of heading to the door, he suddenly walked toward Ava's bedroom. Ava, confused and worried, called after him and asked where he was going. He mumbled something about needing to change clothes. Feeling uncomfortable, she told him there was another bathroom outside, but he ignored her and went inside, locking the door. Ava found Jay and explained the strange behavior she had noticed from the server. Together, they went to the room and demanded he come out. When he appeared, he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, but his expression darkened. "This isn't your house." Jay told him that he was Ava's fiancé and they lived there. The server went berserk, screaming about how Ava had seduced him, babbling nonsense that she couldn't understand. Then, he rushed into the kitchen, throwing food out of the fridge and onto the floor without hesitation. He screamed obscenities, his face twisted with rage. Jay had to call on his two brothers to forcibly remove the server. Fortunately, the party still proceeded as planned. Around 5 a.m., Ava woke with a start to the sound of a door creaking open. She nudged Jay awake, whispering that someone was inside the house. He tried to reassure her, saying maybe his brother had forgotten something like his wallet. But then, the noise grew louder, coming from outside. Jay told her he'd check it out while she should hide in the closet and call 911. Before she could dial, A familiar, disturbing voice echoed through the room. She stepped into the living room and saw the server, shirtless, his eyes wild with madness. He lunged at Ava, but Jay blocked him, holding him down while she called the police. Jay warned the server, "The police are on their way," but the server just smiled. "I need to make sure she's okay and unharmed." Jay stayed between them as Ava climbed out of the window. The server broke free from Jay's grip and ran into the kitchen. Just in time, when the police arrived, the server was in the kitchen, swinging a knife wildly. He ignored the police's orders to drop the weapon, forcing them to subdue him with a taser. The police searched the entire house, finding nothing unusual except one thing. Ava suddenly remembered that he had gone into her room. Upon checking, she realized some of her clothes and personal items were missing. Afterward, Ava and Jay cleaned the house, discarding everything the server had touched. They replaced all the kitchen items and made the house feel like home again. The server was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but the trauma and violation he caused still haunted Ava. She was grateful, though, that Jay had stood by her and protected her, helping her recover from the emotional ordeal. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child, I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying, tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The hitchhiker's nightmare. The chilly spring air bit at my skin. It was a quiet night as I left the Subway restaurant. The shopping mall where the Subway was located was desolate, except for a few dim streetlights casting pale circles of light over the empty parking lot. Though the place was somewhat old and empty, the quality was decent, and it was only a 5 to 10 minute drive from my house. As I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man walking past the stores. He was tall, disheveled, wearing sweatpants and a dingy t-shirt. As he passed by the window, he glanced at me. It was only a brief look, but something about him left me feeling uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy. I pushed open the door, my breath visible in the cold night air, and started walking the short distance to my car. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, they were faint, but they quickly grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the man from earlier. He was walking toward me, and before I knew it, he was right next to me. I stopped, unsure of what he wanted. He was too close for comfort. He asked me for a ride to the gas station just down the street. His voice was calm, almost friendly, as he pointed toward a gas station nearby, visible from where we stood. It didn't seem far, and it was on my way home. Though I hesitated, the cold air and his seemingly urgent demeanor convinced me to agree. I got into my car, and the man sat in the passenger seat. I drove out of the parking lot, down the empty streets, making the short drive to the gas station. Neither of us said a word. The entire time, something felt off about the situation. I kept telling myself everything was fine, it was just a quick ride, after all. When we arrived at the gas station, I parked in the back of the lot. I expected him to get out right away, but he didn't. Seconds passed in uncomfortable silence, and my anxiety grew. I said, "All right, we're here," trying to sound casual, hoping he would leave, but he didn't move. The man stared straight ahead, making no move to get out of the car. My heart started pounding as I repeated myself, this time more firmly. "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" Finally, he spoke. His tone had changed. It was no longer friendly, but cold, almost irritated. He told me this wasn't the right gas station, and that he needed to go to a different one farther away. I glanced at the gas station in front of us, confused and worried. I was sure this was the place he pointed to. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I told him I wasn't going any farther and that I needed to go home. The man didn't reply. He just sat there, silent. The tension in the car was building, and I could feel my pulse quickening. I asked him to get out, my voice now shaky. He refused and said no. I glanced around the gas station, looking for someone who might help. A few cars were parked under the bright lights, but I didn't dare move. He seemed stubborn, and I was scared he might harm me. I felt trapped, like the walls of the car were closing in on me. Suddenly, a noise broke the tension, a car door slamming nearby. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw a woman stepping out of her car, walking toward the gas station store. Seeing someone else, even from a distance, gave me a brief surge of courage. I turned back to him, my voice stronger this time. "I need you to get out of my car, right now." His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said he wouldn't get out until I took him where he needed to go. I couldn't take him anywhere else, and I couldn't sit there any longer with the fear gnawing at me. I glanced back at the gas station, hoping someone would look my way, but no one did. I needed an exit, and fast. I reached for my phone, trying to act as casual as possible. I said, "Okay," to buy myself some time, pretending to check the GPS for the other gas station he claimed he wanted to go to. He said nothing, but his eyes never left me. As my hand fumbled for the phone in my pocket, I could feel his gaze, watching my every move. My heart raced as I unlocked my phone, pretending to look up directions. In reality, I was opening the keypad. My mind raced, calculating how quickly I could call for help without him noticing. But before I could act, he suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my wrist. Panic exploded in my chest. He squeezed my wrist painfully as he leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. I tried to pull away, but he held me tight. His voice was cold, threatening, telling me not to even think about it. I froze. My breath became shallow as I tried to stay calm and think of a way out. The gas station lights cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look even more terrifying. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a police car pulling into the gas station, its headlights sweeping over the parking lot. The other man must have seen it too, because his hand suddenly loosened my wrist. Without warning, he let go of my wrist, opened the door, and got out of the car. He didn't look back, just walked quickly into the darkness behind the gas station. For a few minutes, I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My wrist throbbed where he had grabbed me, but I was too shaken to focus on the pain. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I didn't want to stay there any longer. Without looking back, I drove out of the parking lot and onto the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, my mind replayed the encounter over and over, each detail etched into my memory. What did he want? What would have happened if the police hadn't shown up? One thing was certain: I would never make the mistake of letting a stranger into my car again. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat in the silence of my car for a long time, staring out at the empty street. The weight of what had just happened settled over me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to fully feel the fear. After resting for a bit, I was scrolling through the web to calm my nerves when I stumbled upon Complaint and wanted reports about a man who looked exactly like the one I had encountered. He was known for tricking people into giving him rides, then using various methods to steal something. He wanted after following his victims. Using the phone number I found in the article, I immediately reported to the local police where I last saw him, right that same night. Thank God, I realized how lucky I was to have escaped that mysterious man and survived. Lucky that the police had been there. Lucky that I hadn't driven him farther and made it home safely. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard something, a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks, his sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back, glancing at Rena's bedroom. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. The phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape. Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm. But the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away.